Matt here again with another episode of the Richmond Elite podcast. Today, I'm lucky to have my former teammate, former roommate, Eddie Smith on. Eddie was a two-time All-American at Loras College. Like I said, he was my teammate there for a little while. We ended up coaching together after college for a little bit. It's a guy who's been around a lot of good coaches, is a good coach himself, runs his own wrestling program now, or wrestling club now. So I'm very excited to have him on. Just had our coach Trevor on last episode, so hopefully you can outshine Trevor.
Oh, easy.
A lot of the stuff is probably going to be the same. I told him, like, now when I'm coaching kids, they probably think I'm Kit, just like a better
Mhm.
looking version of him. Basically, that's all it is. But so we're going to give Eddie just a couple minutes here to give a background on himself, kind of talk about his career a little bit and how it's led him to where he's at now, and then we'll just kind of have a little conversation about some coaching. So Eddie, welcome, and the floor is yours.
For sure, thank you. Yeah, I've been involved with the sport forever, because my dad was a high school wrestling coach, and he didn't completely force wrestling down my throat, but he was drilling moves on me in the living room when I was, like, 2 years old. So I was kinda just surrounded by it, and he would give me, VHS tapes of the Hawkeyes throughout the '90s, like, the '92 era through the '98 era, pretty much anytime the Hawkeyes were on Iowa Public Television, my dad had it recorded on a VHS tape, so I got to watch, like, Tom Brands, Terry Brands, the Steiner brothers, Tom Ryan, that was in, like, the '92 era, then later on, Joe Williams, Lincoln McElravy, Mike Mena, all those great Hawkeye teams that were like legendary, that everybody in Iowa wants to go back to now that Penn State is so good, but it's all
Right?
right.
Yeah.
That's how things evolve, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah. Then really got into training and stuff in like late middle school, early high school, which I think is good. Um Coach Matt and I have talked a lot about how early on you more so just want to get kids acquainted with the sport and get them to like the sport and get them to have fun with it. And then once they start to get to middle school, high school, when the competitions ramp up and get a little bit more serious, that's when the kids themselves usually get more into it, if they love the sport truly, because they're going to see that they need to work hard in order to do what they want to do at the competition. So that was kind of the case for me. Got more into it in high school, started doing the Fargo teams and stuff, which now I'm lucky enough to be able to coach and help out the young kids who are where I was at. Um, Qualified for state 4 times in high school, placed 3 times, never won. I love to lose in the semifinals to people I was ranked ahead of. That was my favorite thing to do in high school. Pretty much the opposite of Matt, who was
Yeah.
seeded like 9th and beat 2 nationally ranked guys to win state, but
Yeah.
I never got to do that. But then got recruited out of high school by Coach Miller at Loras, who was 2-13 the year before Matt and I got there. Um, was able to help recruit Matt to Loras halfway
Yep.
through my freshman season because we needed a 25-pounder in a bad way. And then we ended up taking that team from the bottom to the top. Not that we did. It was our teammates, our coaches, and we had an amazing coaching staff, people like John O'Reilly, Trevor Kittleson, Rick Healy, and then TJ Miller, all on one staff. It was a pretty good group that we had. I was able to All-American my junior year, got 4th, and then my senior year was ranked like 4th or 5th, going into nationals, and it got canceled for COVID, of course. But yeah, that was also the year we broke Wartburg's streak, which I had heard people, D3 coaches in our conference, now the American Rivers Conference, so it used to be the Iowa Conference, had told me nobody will ever beat Wartburg. They have
Mhm.
a bit of a pipeline from Iowa to D3, but we were able to do that through just working hard one day at a time and having a good team culture that I feel like attracted a lot of good recruits then, like Jacob Krako and Brandon Murray. So yeah, hopefully that's not too in depth. I dropped a bunch of names that people probably
Yeah.
have no idea who I'm talking about, but whatever.
No, I mean, if they're interested, they'll definitely Google it and they'll find out who those guys are for sure from that aspect of things. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because not a lot of people, especially like in the new setting that I'm in right now, like understand wrestling to the fullest degree, right? So they like to hear about this stuff. They like to hear kind of the backstories on everything like that, and you know, how close the wrestling community actually is, even though it seems like it's so, far away from every other sport. But once you're kind of in that circle, you kind of understand it a lot more. But yeah, we touched on it a little bit with Kit. It was like the team culture that we had at Loras was something that just like never can be replicated again. I feel like, you know what I mean? And that's like, that might be bias. And then, every person who's on a good team is probably going to say, this team culture is just something that like can never be the same. But I feel like with Loras, it was like a bunch of dudes that weren't really friends before we got there. We had no idea who each other were, right? From all different places, all different kinds of lifestyles, right? We had people from, all the way from New Orleans, from Iowa, Wisconsin, Jersey, so a bunch of different personalities. Um, and a lot of times, like, I feel like the personalities didn't even mesh that well, right? And
Right.
that's craziest part. Like have complete opposite spectrum people, and it was just the fact that everyone fell in love with like the same process, I think, and the same goal. That really made the biggest difference. But for you, it was like you were surrounded, like you said, by like championship level wrestling your entire life, whether or not you even knew it. And it was kind of the same with me, growing up in a club scene. We both were, part of clubs and part of teams that were, very high level from the start, right? Like I had Eric Jurgens as my coach growing up. So how important for you do you think that like beginning stage of your career where you didn't even know what was happening necessarily, how important was that for you now that you're in the position that you're in?
Oh, huge. Yeah, it's crazy to realize now that I'm helping young kids as a club coach,
Mhm.
how far advanced they're getting compared to the kids who aren't wrestling club and who aren't wrestling in the off season and having these um, influences from outside their high school. Because I was lucky to have, a high school coach and my dad who was extremely dedicated, but not everybody has that. A lot of people have a high school coach who's just doing it out of the goodness of his heart so that the team has a coach, but he doesn't know that much about wrestling, and they'll admit that. So it's, essential for these kids to come to club. And I mean, you and me, when we were coaching, I think we would say all the time, like, we want to go back in time and help these kids, like intervene in these kids' careers earlier on, because we would get them by college and you could still do a lot of work and improve if, you have a kid who's going to work their butt off. But if you haven't laid the groundwork as a kid, as a youth, as a high schooler, as far as technique and whatnot, it's much, much more difficult versus if you have a kid who's been training, more or less year round since middle school. There's a base of technique and understanding of the sport there that's laid in youth. Even if the youth kids don't realize it, you can see it when a sixth grader sweep single with how it evolves from one year to the next, and all of a sudden they're hitting that sweep single better than some college kids do. It's the number one time in a developing person's brain when they can learn new skills and create habits that will last the rest of their life. So it's extremely important. And you and I, related in that we had that our whole lives, kind of, without even knowing it, without even knowing how lucky that we were to have that. And now it's cool as club coaches to try and give that to other kids. And, I would say I was concerned about coaching not college kids because I had coached college for so long. I'd gotten used to, focusing on high level technique and fixing minute details in college wrestlers' strategies to help them improve. And I still love doing that, but my favorite to work with is kind of the youth, because you can
Yeah.
almost start to program these things that they'll need later on in their career, in their brains, like reattacks and whatnot, when they're very young. So yeah, I'd say it's huge. Every state place winner now pretty much is training at clubs in the off season.
Yeah. And that was gonna honestly, that's a great segue because my next question was gonna be, you know, we both coach at, a very high level, and we've coached at, this is still a high level. Our clubs are still, held to a certain high level standard, but it's not as high level technique wrestling wise. And just in the fact of like, for club, we're going over a lot of the same base stuff for weeks and weeks and weeks, right? You can kind of advance a little bit faster in college, like you said, because they already have that base knowledge. But I know like a lot of the girls that I coach, they are probably so sick and tired of doing freaking down block and run to a corner and front headlock, run to a corner and get into our post on our single leg. Like all that stuff, I just know I'm super annoying. And I know that Kit was super annoying to us and coaches were super annoying to us when that was happening. But Um, like, I always try to tell them, like, I was in your position where I was just like, "Dude, shut up. Stop telling me
Mhm.
to run the corner. Stop telling me to get to my single leg. Stop telling me to get head position." Like, but now looking back on it, like, when I just do those things when I'm wrestling, I'm like, "Oh, this makes wrestling so much easier." Like, stop making the sport so hard on yourself by trying to find all these new moves, all these different, like, advantages, right? Like, maybe just stick to what we're really good at and stick to the basics and get really good at those things, and then you can expand your knowledge a lot more, right? And that's with anything, right? Like, that's not just sports, that's just in general. If you're gonna get good at something, you have to get good at the very base level of it before you can even advance in it whatsoever. Um, and I think that we did a really good job of that at Loras. And kind of the process that we had there was one day at a time. And really, when we focused one day at a time, we were only, in the present moment. And a lot of times that ended up, you know, really, really playing to our advantage. Like when we got to Wartburg, I felt like none of us were nervous to go out and compete at that biggest moment. You know what I mean? Just because we were just like focused on what we had to do at that time. And it was try to win that match, right? Try to win that duel. Um, but now, yeah, it's kinda just a different setting, and the club setting is a little bit weirder because, parents are involved a lot more, outside factors like sports or other sports are involved a lot more, but we always talk about how parents can be either the biggest, like, aid in success or the biggest hindrance to an athlete's success, especially at a young age. So having a club coach like us, I think, is very beneficial because we were surrounded by good parents who were supportive, of the sport and of our careers. So right now, do you think the biggest factor for kids is the setting that they're in club-wise, or is it the outside factors that, like, home, their parents' lifestyle kind of aiding them into their success? Like, what do you think the biggest factor is between those 2, either club scene or, like, the outside life that develops an athlete the most?
That's a good question. I would say it's a combination, like, I've seen kids, like, who I won't name them because I don't wanna, like, out them, but I've seen kids with really difficult home lives basically just make, like, wrestling their kinda sanctuary from that, like, their escape from that rough home life, and they end up wrestling D1 and having tons of success, and that's because they use that rough environment to motivate them, and, like, you got the crazy Russian guys in Chechnya and Dagestan, those are 2, they're Russian republics, but they've been, like, war-torn for the last 2 decades, and everyone who comes out of there seems really tough. I
Yeah,
think you have the people who join the war, and then the people who use wrestling as a sanctuary. But even still, that kind of shows how your environment is what creates you. And I would say most of the time, though, when people are in a bad environment, it affects them negatively. So I guess what I'm saying is you can escape a bad environment, but if you have a kid who's getting the support from their parents at home, whose parents are not just hyping them up all the time, but holding them accountable, and making sure that they remain disciplined and making sure that they remain honest and living a good lifestyle outside of wrestling.
right.
That's the easiest place where you can have something special happen because
And that's a balance, right? Like, a lot of parents
yeah.
don't get, um and, we struggle with this in every realm, whether it's strength conditioning or it's wrestling practice or whatever it may be. Like, and this isn't a shot at any specific parent. This is just general, but it's like they come in and they're like, okay, Eddie needs to work on getting faster. Like, why are we not running so much? Like, why are you not making him do sprints every time? Or like, hey, like I saw Jordan Burroughs hit this double leg against this Russian guy in the Olympics. Why can't Eddie hit that double leg, in matches? Well, it's
Mhm.
like because Jordan Burroughs is the highest peak of athleticism when it comes to wrestling, right? He is the best athlete when it comes to wrestling. And so that's why he can hit those things. That's why, Tyreek Hill is so fast because he is at the top of the top, right? Like he wasn't just doing, sprints to get that fast. He was doing base level stuff like getting stronger, getting more athletic, learning how to wrestle, learning how to use their body a lot more. So, and it's like you said, it's a balance and it's a combination of both. But I think the biggest thing is that parents need to be more patient with their athletes in their career because, you know, just because your kid's 6 years old and he's, you know, excited to wrestle doesn't mean that he should be competing at the highest level yet, right? Like maybe keep him more local first and have him get confidence and have him, have friends in sports rather than just trying to take him to Tulsa or take him to folk style nationals right away. Because a lot of the times it doesn't work with the fact of like they lose matches and they just lose confidence, right? If they're not ready for that situation. And then it makes them more scared to compete, and it makes them more nervous to compete, and it makes them kind of shy away from that feeling of competition rather than like grasping it and really embracing it. And you and me, and you can probably touch on this a lot too, is we are both very, very anxious people when it came to competition, right? And like I think that's the biggest thing I see with coaching girls, especially because it's a lot more emotional, a lot more
Yeah.
emotionally invested in the sport. So I'm trying to instill a lot more mindset things with the fact of being nervous is an okay thing. So if you want to touch on that a little bit, because I know you and me were probably at the top tier of that, where I was like damn near throwing up before matches a lot of times because I was so nervous. So, how'd you kind of deal with that, and how'd you kind of learn how to, manage that, and also instill kind of a new mindset with your own athletes about that as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's one of the things sometimes parents have a harder time understanding, especially those who didn't compete. Like, I see, I think a parent's biggest job is to be a supporter of the kid. Like, I was very resistant to even get any wrestling advice from my dad, even though he was my coach, just because he was my dad. And you'll see parents like throwing a million moves at their kid before a match, do this, do that, do that. And it's like your kid is probably in this hyper nervous adrenaline rush state right now, getting ready to compete. He has
Right.
no idea what you're telling him. And what he
Yeah.
does when he goes out there, he's going to fall back on his habits, his
Yeah.
practice habits. That's what you do when you're that nervous and that filled with adrenaline. And that's kind of the approach I've taken with my kids. I'm like, don't, because this is the mistake I used to make, was I would fight the nerve so hard, and I would, in practice, I'd be like, maybe this will be the week, of competition where I don't get nervous before I go
Mhm.
out to wrestle. And it would never happen. I would always get nervous because I care about the sport. I wanted to win. So I would get this adrenaline rush. And what I've been telling kids is, don't fight that, embrace that. Tell yourself, good, this means I'm ready. And then if you start getting negative self-talk in your head, you can't just fight against it. You have to replace it with positive thoughts. You have to, even if you're not actually feeling it, force yourself to say, I'm ready. These nerves mean I'm ready. This adrenaline means I'm ready. And it's not, it's not that you're going out there and trying to do something new or trying to do something exotic. Because like I said, what's going to happen when you go out there is you're going to fall back on your habits. So that's what I tell the kids, when you go to compete, there shouldn't be that much thought behind it. There shouldn't be that much besides, I'm ready, I'm hyped up, let's go do exactly what I do best. Like you said earlier, not trying to do a bunch of new moves, but let's just go do what I do. And then I
Mhm.
also tell them that in practice, because, like when we drill our single legs, we have to drill a setup, we have to drill a shot, and then we have to drill a finish, and it all has to be good. It all has to be perfect, because what you do in practice is going to become your habit. And then if you build good habits, you shouldn't have that much to worry about, on competition. Just go
Right.
do what you've been training to do. Go hit your re-attacks and your go-to shots and your go-to setups, and don't stop for 6 minutes. And it makes things more simple. So yeah, I think it comes down. What I've been telling them is fall back on your habits, and then make sure that the habits you've built in practice are good. And then
Yep.
don't fight that adrenaline rush. Embrace it to whatever extent that you can. Sometimes one thing I've talked about with Eric Kincaid, who's having a lot of success at the college level, is, he says he loves adrenaline. And we've been saying, and Zeb Ganida has been in on these conversations too. Got third at nationals in D3 last year. Anxiety and adrenaline rush, like the positive adrenaline rush, are like two sides of the same coin. So it's not, going out there and having zero anxiety. No, it's almost embracing your anxiety and saying, no, this anxiety is positive energy. This is an
Right.
adrenaline rush. It's not nerves that are going to freeze me up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the times that's why the Penn State style of wrestling is so attractive now. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
you look at any of those guys, and if you look at their interviews, they're talking about how much fun they're having competing, and how like, excited they are to compete and how grateful they are for it. And then you go out there and watch them wrestle, and it's like they're not just talking about this and like just spewing crap just cuz, right? They're not trying to convince anybody that they're like here to have fun. Like they go out there and they actually have fun. They could be down by 12 points, or they could be up by 12 points. They're still going to be doing what they need to do and just wrestling and just enjoying the sport of what it is. And a lot of times I think, um, going back to parents, it's like they watched that Iowa style of wrestling that you were talking about, back in the day. And guess what? Sports evolves, everything evolves, and like it changes and the whole game changes completely. Um, and so now it's not so much like we got to freaking hammer, hammer, hammer all the time, right? And like I think a lot of times even with Iowa style wrestling, sometimes that's still the case for them. And a lot of times they end up being really hurt when it comes to NCAAs or Big Tens, like double braces on everything, right? And it's like Penn State always peaks at the right time, and maybe that's the reason why. Their practices are a little bit more laid back. They're worried about getting better at wrestling rather than like how hard we can push everybody. And I've kind of modeled my coaching style around that too. It's like,
Mhm.
who would I be to, make kids go balls to the wall 24/7 every time I see them? Because guess what? They're not going to want to come back and see me. They're not going to be excited to come back and see me, right? Like there's some kids that love that, right? Like they enjoy that grind all the time, and that's great, but the majority, the big population of kids is not going to feel that same way, right? Like you're going to have to cater to them a little bit more than to yourself, and that was a big thing that Kit touched on when I talked to him was it's not about us anymore, right? And not about what we want. It's a lot more about what those kids want, right? And I think you can get this a lot more too with coaching on the female side now. Like it's
Yeah.
a lot more tailored to what they are going through, right? Like with guys, it's a little bit different. And there's a lot of positives on both sides, right? Like with girls, like there's no ego, right? There's no, I have to convince them to do anything. It's like, you want me to hit this single leg like this? I'm going to hit the single leg like this, right? Like with guys, you got to beat the crap out of them. Like when we were at Platteville or at Loras, I think the first 2 weeks of practice was just me trying to beat the crap out of the kids so that they would respect me, right? So they would understand like, "Oh, Coach Matt knows what he's doing, right? Like, he knows how to hit the single leg on me 100 times. Maybe I should pay attention." Um, but yeah, so it's a little bit different with girls, which I think is, super, super cool. And I think that's why girls sports are evolving, especially wrestling so much, and growing so much is because these girls are just able to pick up things without having any sort of, overthinking or ego involved with it. So they're able to pick up that technique, get success a lot faster. I mean, we have girls like Greta and Eve, who these girls have been wrestling for what, 2 years, a year and a half, but they understand like the process of it and they love the process of it, and look at how much they've separated themselves from every other person. You know what I mean? It's crazy how it works. But kind of going off of our coaching experience a little bit. So just a backstory: Eddie and I coached together at Loras College right out of college, right after we graduated, and then we went over to Wisconsin Platteville for a little bit there and coached over there at a new program and kind of built that up from the ground up. And um, so going into the club scene now, what are a couple of the big things that you took from collegiate wrestling or coaching at the collegiate level that you use and you kind of ride by in your club scene now?
Yeah, for one, just like a very basic technical thing for running practice is the best college kids when they drill, they're drilling setups, shots, or whatever, offensive attack, and then finishes. And this is
Mhm.
what I noticed a lot of my high school athletes when they're in matches, they shoot and they stop, and then they get extended and guy scores a go behind or they're stretched out hanging onto the leg, very typical high school position. I mean, it happens at every level, but and it's because they're drilling just shoot, stop, shoot, stop. So of course, like we were saying, you're gonna fall back on your habits in matches. If your habit is to shoot and stop, you're gonna shoot and stop. So a lot of good college guys are almost sparring through every drill. The guy isn't giving you full defense, not going live, not beating the crap out of you, but he's making you go through the motions of doing the proper finish every single time. And then when it's in matches, it's just habit. That's what it is for some of those guys who I was talking about earlier who are having a lot of success in college. Eric Kincaid and Zeb Ganida. Like I know when somebody shoots on Zeb, I know exactly where he's going to go, because he's drilled that reattack 100 times. And I know that no matter what reaction that guy gives him, he's going to be okay because he's drilled through that reaction in practice. So
Mm.
college guys definitely drill through the finish and drill their setups more. And that's something I've tried to bring to my high schoolers, and whether they're high level or not, even the lower level ones, start them out drilling that way so it's always their habit,
Yeah,
and then
right, right.
they
And it's
start
got those
figuring out it.
those fine details a lot more, right? Like, it's just going over
Right.
those fine, fine details. Yeah, yep, absolutely. I think that's something that, like I said, kids get really bored of, and especially young kids. Like, I have girls that are freaking 8 years old sometimes, right? Like in my clubs, it's like they're like don't understand that I tell them, put your hand here instead of putting it here. Right? It might just be like a little bit off, right? But on their inside tie or whatever it may be, but it's going to be a huge difference, right? And they don't understand why it is, right? And it's even at the
Right.
high school level, a lot of the times they don't understand why I'm telling them to do something, right? But it's more so like just building the relationship so you don't have to explain yourself a lot more, right? Like they just believe you, they just trust you. But yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um,
Right.
Going off, do you have more on that? I kind of cut you
Well,
off there, my bad.
no, you're good. I guess I could add, and two, letting kids figure stuff out themselves a little bit too. Like you said, you can show them something and they might not understand it, but then what I've been trying to do more lately, and you can do this in college because you can wrestle with the kids a lot more. And I can wrestle
Mhm.
with some of my bigger high schoolers, and that's good. So you can give kids the exact feel that you want them to work. So you can kind of show them why what you're telling them will work. But with high school kids, I also try and have them wrestle live situations because they'll figure it out themselves a little bit.
Mhm.
Like maybe you
Yeah,
tell them something and they don't get it, then you put them in a live situation and they can't score the takedown or they're giving up a takedown, then they think, "Okay, maybe I'll try what Coach Matt showed me."
mhm.
And once they can figure it out in live. So, the other thing I would say that I've learned is, like, all learning is self-learning. If you have somebody who's checked out and doesn't wanna learn, doesn't wanna listen to you, they're not gonna learn. But, if they're engaged and they're, trying to learn, they can, and then they learn on their own. Like they learn through the giving up a takedown in live, because then they get angry. Oh, I don't want to give up that takedown, and then they think back to what you coached them. So
Right.
yeah, I would say that, and let kids hear things from different voices. Let them hear things from different coaches, because you might tell them. There were so many times at Platteville where I would say something 20 times, and then the kid wouldn't listen, and then Coach Matt says it in a different way,
Right.
and they lose a match in competition, so their mind is open. All of a sudden, they start doing it. And you can't be
Yeah.
upset about that as a coach. All that matters is that they eventually figure it out.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the coaching style, I mean, at least for me, like I said, I've been around a lot of good coaches, but I think I almost have modeled my coaching style around what I don't wanna be rather
Hmm.
than what I do wanna be, and it's making me who I am, right? But, like, it's kind of hand in hand. It's what I wanna be, but I'm modeling it in the fact of, like, I don't want to be this kinda coach, right? I don't wanna be an ego coach. I don't wanna be a coach where it's my way is the only way, right? Like, I would love for, and we have a situation like this. So we have a girl, Eve, who lives in Dubuque and goes to Eddie's club, Dubuque Wrestling Club, a couple times a week. But then she'll also drive down an hour and come to my club on the opposite days. And so would we be ego coaches by saying, Eve, you have to be a part of one club? 100%. That is just not helping her at all. That's just, doing what I think I want, right? Like I just want her to be mine. That's it. But no, I'm very, very glad that she's going up to get stuff from Eddie and having other partners and doing all that stuff, right? So um I think the biggest problem now is that every coach and people might take this to heart, which whatever, but every coach thinks that they're a good coach when in reality there's not that many good coaches in the world. You know what I mean? There's more bad coaches than good, I think, at least who I've met. Or at least what I've seen in like the high school levels and all that stuff. And right. And that's not taking it away anything from anybody. Like it's a hard job. It's a hard thing to be a good coach. Um, but sometimes you need to bring in other people that are good coaches, right? And I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, that was kind of what it was at Sauk when you were there, right? Like your dad was probably like the main guy, but there was somebody who kind of ran the program and did all the other stuff, like the paperwork stuff and blah blah blah. Blah. But when it came to wrestling, like your dad was the guy. So like you kind of experienced that a little bit, and can you kind of touch on how that like dynamic honestly made your team better rather than like the head coach just taking all that glory and kind of just trying to do it his way?
Yeah, absolutely. My dad was, I was lucky. He was good. He understood that, and he obviously coached me my whole life. And, the older I got, the better I got at listening to him. But he understood that even for me as his son, I was going to need to hear outside voices. I was going to need to hear other coaches, and I was going to be more inclined to listen to them because they weren't my dad, and
Right.
everybody rebels against their dad a little bit when they're 14 to 18. So he
Right.
knew that I needed to hear things from different voices. So we had, Matt Gaffney, who's the head coach there now, and another guy named Justin Schrader. These guys had all wrestled in college. Um, and they knew that I wanted to wrestle in college, and they were helping to get me ready for that level. So bringing in outside coaches, and then he would of course send me to club, and I had this awesome club coach named Brad Owens, and he had brought in a bunch of great assistants to our clubs. So I had all these, awesome voices, and then I would go to junior or not the junior nationals, Fargo, and get, five other awesome coaches and get input from them, and that helped a lot. And what was good about my dad was he never got jealous. He encouraged that. If like I said, if he told me to do something 100 times and I didn't do it, and then another coach told me to do it and I started doing it, he didn't take that personally. He's like, whatever,
Right. He was
as
probably
long as
happy
you're
that you
doing it.
got it figured out. Yeah, right, right.
Exactly. That's how I feel about my kids today. Like you said, I want them to, of course I want them to come to DWC, to my club, but I want them to get as many good coaches and as many good partners as they can. And I get, why club coaches like, demand that you be full time and you can't go back and forth between clubs. I get it from a business perspective,
Mhm.
but from the perspective of your kids, why would you not want them to get some other partners, even if it's just once a week? I get you want to have the kids consistently too, but so you can work with them, but you can get kids to come into your club consistently and still have them every once in a while or once or twice a week go to a different club. And now a lot of them are moving to no drop-ins whatsoever. You can't just pay $10 and come to my club and I'll teach you a few things and run you through a workout, or can't,
Mhm.
drop into my club once every 2 weeks. And for me, I just don't understand that. Maybe it's because our club, is more marketed to the masses and not just the elite. But
Yeah.
we have elite wrestlers at the club too, and I just can't understand why anyone would want to put a block on their own elite wrestlers from, going and experiencing other clubs. Like another, probably a better example is my club coach in high school, Brad Owens. AWA, Askren Wrestling Academy, they've since bought the club that I trained at. They were infringing on his market, of course. AWA was taking over everything in Wisconsin, and previously our club, Advanced School of Wrestling, was the top dog. And then that's just how things change. A new club comes in and they kind of take its place. But rather than fighting that, my coach, Brad, would say, go to AWA camps in the summer, go learn from Ben and Max Askren, who are bringing in, 10 D1 wrestlers to work with the high schoolers at these summer camps. And those were, really useful for me as well in my development as a wrestler. And I got to go, mix it up with all these different partners from other parts of the state, because I would go to these AWA camps in the off season. So, I just wish all the clubs, I wish it didn't have to be so political and we could just share the love and focus on the wrestlers. But
I
I guess
mean,
that's
yeah,
kind of
it's
the
like
nature of it.
it's, it's funny because you say, like, the business side of it, and, like, for me, like, I don't even think about that side of the like, when I'm, like, yeah, like, obviously, the goal is to grow the club, right? And, like, to grow the numbers and grow, but that's not for my own benefit, that's for my girls' benefit, right? Like, I wanna grow the club so they have more partners. I wanna grow the club so that I can, like, I'm doing a dual team in January, like, last year around this time, I probably had, like, 3 girls in my club, but now I have enough to make a dual team, right? Like, that's what is exciting to me rather than, like, you know, how much money I'm bringing in, right? And, like, maybe that's different from other coaches, and maybe, you know, coaches will think that that's just not the way to think about it, which is great, whatever, like, that's good for them. But for me, I think I'm gonna get a lot further in growing my club if I'm not worried about how much I'm bringing in money-wise, and if I'm just worried about who I'm bringing in and how I'm developing these kids. And, for me, that's richer than money, is the development of kids, especially kids that don't know how to wrestle. Like, I have girls that probably have never stepped on the mat before, right? And, like, to go out and see them win matches is probably one of the coolest thing ever, right? And, like, the excitement they get from that, and same with boys, not just girls, obviously. But um, yeah, I think it just goes back to, like, ego coaching. And again, it's just, it could be the biggest killer to a lot of teams and a lot of kids, and it can make kids not like sports, and it can make them kind of not, not like to compete, like we talked about before. But and you are another good example of that as well, because even after we were done competing in college, Eddie competed on the Greco-Roman scene, and went down the street to Dubuque and you trained down there, right? And, like, in college, we did not like University of Dubuque. That was our rival, right? Like, we did not like them. We did not want to wrestle with them. We didn't want to be surrounded by them. But, they bring in someone like Dennis Hall, right, who's a very elite coach at the in the Greco-Roman scene, it's like, how do you not as an athlete want to go gravitate towards that setting, right? And, you know, maybe at the beginning you got a little bit of like, what the hell are you doing here from people, but I feel like now people understand it a lot more. And I think you can be a good testament to the fact of you would regret not going to that situation because you probably learned so much from other coaches, even at that stage of your career where you were a coach, been around the sport forever. I think the biggest thing is that you were trying to keep learning, and a lot of coaches stop trying to learn after they're done competing. Um, but I told Kit this. I think I got the best I've ever been at wrestling after I was done competing. Like after the college scene, after I didn't have to balance school and balance all this other bull crap that I was going through, right? Like I was just able to get better at wrestling and learn about wrestling a lot more with a developed brain, essentially, rather than doing it when
Mhm.
I was a kid. So it was basically combining both of those things together. But I think that just growing your knowledge constantly is such a good tool for coaches that they just don't take advantage of. Um, so, like, in what ways do you try to develop your coaching style, rather than, the experiences you've already gone through? How are you continuing to kinda develop that as you keep going forward here?
Yeah, and I guess it's a little different for me because I'm still competing, but,
Right.
Greco is much different than, freestyle folk style. So if I wasn't constantly watching the high level freestyle and folk style and studying it, I would fall behind now that, I'm not competing and testing my folk style skills multiple times a year. um it's you have to study and keep up with the sport. You can't think, you can't rest on what you already know. You have to keep learning because, as we were saying earlier, the sport evolves so much from year to year. And I mean, there's so many resources available now in terms of like flow wrestling and technique videos like that. And I would recommend coaches, don't just watch the matches, but watch the technique videos because there, an abundance of high level wrestlers and high level coaches showing how they teach technique. And I remember my dad used to drive me crazy. He had, a stack of wrestling DVDs, and he would make us go through the moves, and he would practice all the moves on me. But that was how he stayed up with the technique. And that's also how you can learn how to teach techniques that you didn't do as an athlete, which you're gonna need to do. I was very short and stocky, and I have kids who are long and lanky. So
Right.
I never did an ankle pick when I was wrestling, but I have to know how to teach an ankle pick to them. So I watched David Taylor videos on how to do that, and then you can send those to your athlete too. Like, this is the beauty of coaching in the tech era, the social
Yeah,
media era or whatever. I can, study a move, teach it to the kids at practice, and then send them Kyle Dake teaching that move on YouTube.
right.
And yeah, I would say you have to study to stay up with it, but studying is pretty easy with all the resources we have.
For sure, yeah, and I think, like, even for me, when I'm going to either watch, like, a high level competition or, if I'm going in person to watch it, whether it's on the TV or in person, I think I'm also studying, like, how the coaches handle themselves in the corner, how the coaches are talking to the athlete, right? Like, um, and not, like, necessarily trying to model myself after that, but also just take pick up those certain tendencies, right? Like, I always used to think that the more you yell in the corner, the better. But now I'm like watching, Kale Sanderson. That guy just sits there and he'll say one or two things, and during the breaks and when it's important. But it's like, why are you screaming at the top of your lungs every second of this match? Like, one, the kid's not gonna hear you. Like, it's so hard to hear during a wrestling match or any athletic competition as it is with the noise going on. And also you're just overstimulating the hell out of them, right? Like they're just not gonna understand what you're saying because you're just saying so many things and you're just yelling at them, right? They just shut down from that. Um, so yeah, it's like not necessarily what I got growing up or even competing. Like I felt like all my coaches were always yelling the whole match, right? But it's like, okay, how did I end up responding to that? Not very well, right? Like I didn't end up picking up a lot of knowledge in matches because of that. So I think the other way, the other route is better where it's like you're kind of just more calm and relaxed, and that also feeds that calmness to the athlete as well, right? Like I know in college a lot of the times like Trevor Kittleton's a very hyped up guy, right? He's very amped up. I did not want that before my matches. I did not need to be more amped up because my brain and my heart were like going 1,000 miles per hour as it is, right? So I needed to be around someone who was like chill and calming, and that was Jono, right? That was John Aurelian. He was a quiet guy, very to himself, very like low level when he talked, like his voice was very soft, like, you know what I mean, everything like that. So I think that's a big thing too. It's just like, don't try to be like this like David Goggins like style of coach all the time where you have to be super tough and super intense. It's like not a lot of athletes even need that, right? Because the competition itself is even more intense than what you're doing, so you're just adding to that stress a lot more. And I think you were like that a lot, even with Jeremy Bofelli. Shout out Worm here because he's a part of that too. Because he talked to both of us before matches. And Jeremy Bofelli, just a backstory, is Eddie's assistant over at DWC. He's been around Loras Wrestling for a while. He's a good buddy of ours, but for him, it was like he wasn't even on our staff, and it was somebody completely disconnected that was just a huge fan of what we were doing. And for him to step in and do that kind of stuff was, game changing in a lot of our matches. I know for you, it was even more game changing than me, but um, yeah, I mean, having kind of like that outlet a little bit where it's not always so intense is such a big thing. And I think now in sports, it's like the biggest moments are, what kids want, right? But they're not necessarily prepared for what that biggest moment's going to bring
Yeah.
them emotionally, right? Like
Mhm.
you can try to explain it as a coach, but you have to understand it and you have to feel it. And it's kind of going back to what you were talking about with nerves. Like you care about the outcome. That's why you have nerves. And I just made a video about this for our page. But it's like if you don't have that, if you've never had that feeling of competition or pressure, like dude, you are screwed if you're getting thrown into the fire, right? Like you have it's something different than like, you can ever really experience. And for you, I'm sure you've known that you were probably so nervous competing at nationals but like then you probably went and competed at the world level and you were like, holy shit, like college was nothing. Like I am so much more nervous now than I was. It's just all comes with whatever level you're competing at, right? But yeah, I think going off of that a little bit, it's like how are you able to kind of manage, and the club scene's a little bit different. How are you able to manage all the different personalities and all the different emotional sides of things when it comes to your athletes now compared to when we were in college? Because in college, there's a lot of different personalities, but everybody's there for the same reason. They're there to be a wrestler, or they're there to play football because that's what they committed there for. In the club scene, it's not like that. It could be somebody's trying it out. It could be somebody has zero interest in it. It could be they're just doing it for another sport. Like, how do you kind of manage and deal with each different person individually rather than like a whole club as a team?
Yeah, there's a little more freedom to do that, I feel like, with the clubs.
Mhm.
You can pull kids in for one-on-ones or whatever, give kids more coaching if they're, more if they're asking for it, if they're more elite than some of the other kids. But I think you just have to know the kids and know where they're at, and not be afraid to adjust for different kids. Like there are times where we have a bunch of high level kids in the room and then we have four beginners, and I'll tell the beginners, you guys just work on single legs right now, while
Right.
we're working something super high level. I'll split it up for them. And it's the same thing with dealing with their emotions. Like there's two kids there's a kid I coach now who's like direct opposites with his brother. His brother needs to be hyped up. His brother needs to be yelled at, or sorry, no, it's the reverse. The kid I work with needs to be hyped up. He needs
Yeah.
to be yelled at. You could, the best time to teach him stuff is after he's lost a match, and then you
Mhm.
just be harsh on him because he's down on himself a little bit, but he's like kicking himself, and he needs you to come in and say, well, this is what you did wrong, and kind of get intense with him a little bit. And that's how he listens, that's how he learns. And his brother's the opposite. If I were to come up to him and start sternly telling him techniques after a match, he'd be like, oh, and wrestle like
Right.
crap his next one. So you have to understand your kids emotionally, and then be okay with that. Like I think the old school style of coaching is just like one size fits all. If you can't get on board with what I'm saying as a coach, then that's your problem and you're a piece of crap. And to some degree, yeah, you need the same level of discipline with all your kids, but
Mhm.
the one size fits all coaching, just isn't going to work. You need to be adopting as a coach to the kids, within reason. Like I said, you still have that baseline of discipline that you need to instill in every one of your kids, but understand that the kids are at different skill levels, experience levels, and different emotional levels. Like kids
Right.
develop so differently too in their brains. And yeah, you just got to keep that in mind, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the times, my boss Jared and I talk about the pyramid of specificity. We just talk about that in general with like athletics, right? Like when you're young, you play a bunch of different sports, right? Because that's your base. And then as you go on, right, like you kind of get more specific with what you want to do in your career and kind of do training that, kind of goes around the specific sport that you want to do. And I think that's can even be broken down even more to each individual sport, right? Like the one size fits all is that base level, right? Like that's where we teach, head position and staying in your stance and doing all these like very, very basic things, right? And like that's where it's very, very broad. But then you have all these different kinds of athletes that develop differently, that, grow differently as, physically and mentally. So then it gets a lot more specific as you go up that pyramid, right? Like you have your top guys or top girls. That's where you're teaching very high level technique, right? But then you're also able to kind of dumb it down, right? Not in a bad way, dumb it down, but dumb it down and make it more basic for, the lower level, the lower level, lower level, until you get back down to that base again. And you're still showing base stuff. Like I said, I'm still showing base stuff to this day. Like I had practice
Oh,
last night, and the first thing that we went over last night was sprawl go behinds. You know what I mean? Like my high school girls are doing that, my college girls are doing that, and my 8-year-olds
yeah.
are doing that. But that's because that's still something you have to practice, right? Like you don't just not swing a baseball bat, because you know how to do it one time or you've already done it a million times. You just don't, stop training that. You still hit off a tee, you still do soft. Like it just depends on what sport you're doing, right? But I think the problem with social media coaching now as well is there's so many like things that people are coming up with, so many training programs that people are coming up with, like, okay, you have to add a band to everything. It's like you don't have to add a resistance band to everything, right? Like they didn't always have resistance bands. How do you think all these top athletes got to where they were at? They weren't, doing all this random stuff. And a lot of times we see that with like Patrick Mahomes is a big one that I deal with in the strength and conditioning world, especially because he posts a lot of his workout videos and he'll be doing all this crazy stuff, right? Like banded throws and all, I mean, whatever it may be, which is great, but he didn't do those things to get to that point. He's doing them now because he's at that level, right? Like he's already built his base. Um, and I think a lot of times that translates to wrestling too. It's like, oh, I want to wrestle like David Taylor. And it's like, okay, but David Taylor learned how to sprawl and go behind when he was your age. And now he's that good because he did the things that were necessary to get to that point, right? So um, it's the patience thing is a big thing. And if a kid can have patience and like kind of fall in love with that process, that's just where they become so elite. It's crazy, right? But um, and I think that's kind of where Loras, when we were there, we made the biggest jump. It was we weren't trying to rush things. Like we weren't looking too far ahead to what like was gonna happen in our matches or what was gonna happen at nationals or in duels or whatever it may be. And it was, how can we get really, really good on this day? And that was it. And I think a lot of that came back to, like you said, the good coaching staff that we had, because they didn't ever really push us that hard in practices. Like people are so mind blown that we only had hour practices at Loras. I'm like, but dude, like you're so used to having 3-hour practices at high school level because you have so many kids that don't know what they're doing. Like it takes that long,
Right.
right? And even on the club scene, like my practices don't go longer than like an hour 15, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
can't keep an attention span for that long, even, like they'll just give up at some point and then it's done, right? So um, I think, coaches are built off of their experiences a lot, right? But they're also built off of what their habits are, like we talked about. Same with an athlete. So if you have bad habits as a coach and you kind of, you know, aren't really strict with your own values and what you believe, then it's just going to end up hurting your club or hurting your team a lot more, right? And I think Kit was a very, very, very value set man when we were at Loras, and that was just instilled in us from day one. And so we didn't really have a choice to kind of go against that or disrespect that in any way, because it was just so hard to, right? And like that's where I feel like the relationship builds so much with athletes. It's when they see like an athlete like you're still competing, right? Like your athletes see that and they understand, like, okay, Coach Eddie is doing everything that I'm doing right now at a higher level, at a harder level, and is still showing up for us every single day and still having a good attitude and still putting in all the work that's necessary. Um, and I feel like a lot of coaches have a hard time leading by example. So then, like that insecurity pushes onto their athletes a lot more. But going into like kind of how you're able to balance your competition and your coaching style, like dude, that's freaking hard. Like people don't understand how hard that is, right? Like it's like flipping a switch in your head, right? Like it's completely night and day different mindsets, right? So I kind of talked about this with Kid a little bit too. Like it's hard to step out of that competition role right away, right? Like, especially right out of college. I had a hard time doing it when we were in the room, 2021, right after the whole COVID thing. It was like, I just wanted to compete still, right? So I went in there to compete. I went in there to wrestle hard with guys, whatever. But then it's like, no, that's not teaching them anything, right? You need to give them that give and take a little bit. But how are you able to balance the two and kind of still, align your goals competition wise with aligning your goals with like coaching wise as well?
Yeah, it's not easy, and every year I have to, decide whether or not I'm gonna keep going. And honestly, lately I've been focusing mostly on coaching and other business ventures, and I want to compete for the next 3 years, but it's expensive too and stuff like that. But I mean, it's just being able to flip that switch. Like, I've gotten very used to knowing, what my training mindset is versus what my coaching mindset is. And, my kids can tell, even like, when I'm drilling for me as an athlete, like that, all I'm focused on is myself, each move, doing everything perfect. Even when my partner's drilling on me, I'm staying in good position. I'm like still focused on me,
Right.
and I might, I might be drilling in a way that pisses my partner off when I'm training for myself, because I mean, I'm
Mhm.
just focused on doing everything right and doing everything hard. Versus
Right.
coaching, it's a lot different than that. You're trying to give kids different feels that they're going to get in matches. Your mind, the main difference is, rather than my mind being focused on my body and trying to get that mind body connection as strong as possible, which is the mindset I have when I'm competing or at practice for myself,
Mhm.
um, is a lot different than, thinking about your athlete's mind body connection and thinking about what they could be doing better. And sometimes, like the other day, I have some high school athletes who came in, and I know that they're not getting pushed at their high school room, so we went live, and I just absolutely beat the crap out of them for
Yeah.
5
Yeah.
minutes. And sometimes they do need that, right? It's good to be able to do that, but most of the time that's not what I'm doing. And even then, after beating them up, I'm thinking about, okay, what did I do on them? What could they do better, rather than what could I do better? And when I'm uh at the peak of training, it'll be 2 practices a day for me, and then I go in to do the
Mm.
practice for the kids after. And it's just a complete mental shift between those 2 practices. Between, it's really, as an adult, you don't get to be that selfish as often
Yeah.
as you do as a kid. And that's really what it is. Like, when I train, this is kind of what I like about it. I just get to be completely selfish. I don't have
Mhm.
to worry about crap except for feeling good and making sure I'm ready for competition. And that's, a relief as an adult, where you're worried about bills, or as a coach, where you're
Yep.
worried about all these things, different kids, administrative things. So it's kind of nice in that sense. But as a coach, you can't do that. You cannot be selfish. You cannot. You've said ego driven. I think that's a really good way to describe it. And really one of the hindrances to being a good coach is, you got to be competitive. You have to want to win. You have to have that drive, but you need to translate that into having a more collective view of it, thinking about your team's
Yep.
culture more, rather than, as an athlete, it was just, what can I contribute to this team's culture? And that's
Right.
good. As an athlete, you should do that, because that's what makes the culture, is the action of individuals. But as a coach, you have to think about everything.
Yep.
Like I always said, it's as an athlete, I never had to worry about cutting weight last minute, because I always had my weight under control. But as
Mhm.
a coach, even if you have 13 kids who are on weight, that one kid who's not on weight, that's now your problem.
Right.
So it's not just taking care of yourself, it's taking care of everything, the weakest links and the strongest links of your team. So it's
Absolutely.
it's a lot different.
For sure. And I think even on the club scene, like people think, um, it's like, oh, you just go run practice a couple times a week and that's all it is, right? Like whatever, you might go to tournaments on the weekends. It's like not if you want to be a good club coach though. Like not if you want to be a good coach, that's not all you do. Like every single day of my life, I am having conversations, whether kids are calling me or they're texting me or whatever it may be, right? And could I push that to the side? Yeah, 100%, but that's just not what I do, right? I'm always answering or I'm always doing that. And like, for example, tomorrow, like one of my girls, she competes this weekend at a big tournament. I'm going to go wrestle her at 6 a.m. tomorrow, right? Like, not a lot of club coaches are going to do that, right? Because it's all what you're willing to put in. for the kids, right? And it's not about me. Like, yeah, do I want to sleep in the extra hour? Yeah, of course. Like, who doesn't want to sleep in the extra hour? But it's not about me. It's about getting her ready to go for this weekend and making her feel confident, right? And those are the things that they're going to remember for forever, right? Like, I remember when Jono and I would drill, every Sunday after tournament. It's like that's something I'm going to remember forever because he put that time out of his day or that effort in for me, right? And that was really um, not selfish, like what you said, going off what you said, it wasn't selfish at all. And for me, it was. For me, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to wake up and get better on a Sunday, one on one with the coach, not having any of my other teammates around to distract me, whatever that may be, right? Like I was being selfish in that moment. And you have to be, like you said, and if you want to be good, you're going to have to be selfish in some sort of way. We always kind of preach that and preach that sacrifice point of things. But kind of last little segment that I got here for you is going off of adversity, and you're somebody who kind of have dealt with adversity throughout your career in like a lot of different ways, right? Whether it was in high school or whether it was in college. What is your kind of your biggest piece of advice for athletes? Because right now, a lot of the times too, we're dealing with it now that season started. It's like, oh, they don't want to come in and get 2 lifts in a week or 1 lift in a week with us because they have practice every single day and practice is so hard, right? But they don't understand the actual adversity that goes into sports, especially at the highest level. And especially as you get higher up in your career, the adversity is just going to grow even more, right? In different ways. So, what's your biggest piece of advice for kids that are kind of stuck in adversity and almost kind of letting that overwhelm them a lot more than kind of embracing that and kind of using it to their advantage?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would bring it back to two quotes that Trevor Kittleson would say, our coach, is that this too shall pass, meaning all bad things pass, all bad things eventually come to an end. Another way to say that is it'll buff.
Mhm.
Always does. Every
Shit'll be
bad thing that yeah, shout out Brady Vogel, another one of our teammates who's now coaching. He would say that all the time, and it was a joke, he'd say it'll buff, always does. But I seriously, that quote helped me when I was in college, when I was dealing with adversity. Like, this will eventually pass and things will get better. And I would tell myself, if you're going through a hard time now, that means is, good times are coming. But in order to do that, you can't just be like, oh, I wish I wasn't in this situation. You have to take it one day at a time. That's the other quote we've said a million times here. It really is important. Staying in the moment and just focusing on what you can do day to day. That's important for so many reasons, but especially with dealing with adversity, because that's how you don't drown in the adversity and in the anxiety. You can't dwell on it. You just have
Mhm.
to focus on doing what you can now that's positive. And sometimes that's hard. Like, I always tell this story. My freshman year, I lost in, triple overtime in the match to go to nationals. And that was devastating. But I knew that year I wasn't working as hard as I could. Right. So that's when I
Right.
really started working hard after that year, rededicating myself to the sport. But then the next year, the same thing happened. I lost in triple overtime again to go to nationals. And that was like, so much worse in terms of adversity, because I was like, I trained hard, I worked hard, and I still came up short, and you have that thought, did I even get better? Was it even worth it? And that was really the time where I just had to stop thinking about it completely, stop thinking about the adversity. Will I ever make it? What do people think of me because I didn't make it last year? No, I'm just going to train one day at a time, and I'm not even going to think about anything except getting better at wrestling. And then the next year I was able to make it through. But it's like, in order to do that, if I would have sat there and thought about it too much, I was driving myself crazy. I was literally going insane. It was just even if it doesn't seem like there's a light at the end of the tunnel, just keep taking it one day at a time. And eventually you will find the light at the end of the tunnel. You always do. And it's going to be better, the harder you work and the more you take things day by day and not think about, you know, sometimes you got to not think about the big picture. You got to have the big picture in mind. But sometimes, the big picture kicks you in the pills and you just have to tune it out and keep working.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing like that I get from that is you have to be proactive against adversity, right? Like a lot of people just, like you said, sit back and kind of just let that soak into their mind a little bit more and kind of soak into who they are, right? Like, oh man, and then it turns into like, God, like everything's against me. Like, the
Yep.
refs are against me, oh, I
Yep.
wasn't, wearing the same shoes that I wore. Like, there's just so many things that you reach for, right? At that point when it's just like, dude, just own up to it, right? Like, we deal with that here. A lot of times people say, like, we don't have time to come in now that practice has started, now that season started. We don't have time. We don't have time. It's like, just tell me that you don't think it's that important, right? Like, I'd rather you just be straight up and honest. Like, you can either embrace the fact that you just don't want to do it, right? And be real with yourself and honestly grow a lot from that rather than just trying to find reasons why you can't. Like, oh, I don't have time, or, oh, like it's just too much going on right now. I'm too sore, I'm too hurt, whatever it may be. Like, no, there's people that are going through a lot more than you, and it's just how you are able to be proactive about changing that, right? Like, if you want winning results, then you got to be proactive on how you're going to do that. You can't just expect it to happen, especially um I think that happens a lot with kids that have early success in their careers. They think like, "Oh, okay, now I'm good. That's it. That's all I got to worry about is just going out there and competing." It's like, no, because that guy that's like doing extra work and that guy that's putting in, more work than you right now, that long term, that's gonna benefit them more than winning 6 Tulsa championships when you're a little kid. Like, I don't care about that, right? Like, I even say to this day, people are like, "Oh, it's cool you won state." It's like, yeah, it's cool. Like, I'm proud that I did that. Would I trade it for a national title? 100 times out of 100, I would trade it. Do I think about winning state anymore? No. Like, I'll talk to people about it. I'll tell them how I got there. I'll tell them the process of it. But do I like live and die by that? I really could care less. You know what I mean? Like, I haven't seen my bracket or my medal since I won state. It's been in my parents' house. You know what I mean? So it doesn't really matter to me. It's like, you know, I gained so much more out of being the person that I am out of my sport rather than like the results I got out of my sport, right? Like, I want the results. I want to be successful in both. But I think the biggest thing for both of us is wrestling has taught us values in life that we're just going to be so successful for the rest of our lives because of that and outside of wrestling. And a lot of times kids struggle to kind of translate their feelings from athletic competition to real life. And it's like, it's the same thing. It's the same mindsets, it's the same kind of values you should have for your training, for your competitions, but just being that person all the time is what's going to make you elite compared to everybody else, right? So, um, last question for you. I need your coolest athletic moment where you kind of broke through, and you're like, wow, I'll remember this for the rest of my life, whether that's a competition, whether that's, from a coach, whether that's from a practice, whatever that may be, right? And then I also need, what is the coolest coaching moment you've experienced since being done competing, or I guess collegiately being done competing?
Ooh, good questions. Um, Man, that's gonna be hard to pick the second one. The first one's hard too. I would say either my freshman year when I placed at state for the first time, because that was such like a rush of self confidence and a feeling, a realization that, oh, if you put in the hard work, it will actually pay off.
Yeah.
And then probably in the same kind of way, the my junior year of college when I finally was able to qualify for nationals. I beat the kid who had beaten me the year previous, and we were actually good buddies at that point. We wrestled all the time. Ben Houston is his name from Cornell. He was really tough, and I beat him in a really barn burner match. One of those matches where you're just completely exhausted at the end because you pretty much gave everything. And that was a huge moment for me, and knowing that I could do that, knowing that, when the pressure was on, when it was, um, huge stadium with all eyes on our
Mhm.
match, in a hard 7-minute close match, I was able to stay tough and, and get the win that really meant something on a larger scale. It wasn't just a random dual meet or something, which is usually where I used to compete my best. It was at the regional tournament. So that was a huge breakthrough moment for me, being able to compete well, with that kind of pressure on in that kind of situation. um, Best moment as a coach, man, there are a lot of good ones. Coaching my brother
Mhm.
to All American was really good. Coaching my sister's fiance and our former teammate Shane Legal in the national finals was a lot of fun.
Mhm.
I would say though, it was either at Platteville watching our boy Coy Roos get this takedown in overtime against a highly ranked kid just by wearing him down for seven, eight
Yep.
minutes. I think it was in overtime. That was something I'll never forget. And then watching Tyler Hanna place at nationals, and by this point we had left Platteville, so I was just in the stands,
Mhm.
screaming for our boy Truck. And then he came over after he all American and like jumped up in the stands and almost pulled me out of the freaking stands because he's huge.
Yeah.
But that we had been going in and wrestling and for 2 years at that point, one on ones, and it was all that work, that 2 years of work. Culminating in that moment was really rewarding, maybe even
Yeah.
more rewarding than some of the things I did as an athlete.
I was gonna say that's what I was gonna, uh, kinda say is, like, sometimes those feelings are even cooler than when you do them yourself, right? Like, watching somebody else because you just know, like, they are so appreciative of, like, what you do for them, right? Like, and also it's cool to just see them enjoy that moment a little bit, but, yeah, I was gonna say the coaching one's a little bit of an open-ended question because there's just so many cool moments that we've both gone through as coaches already, and we're still young in our careers, so, there's definitely more to come, but dang, dude, that was a good combo. I knew it was gonna be a good one for sure because we have a lot of good experiences together and a lot of good values to kinda say to kids. Make sure that you guys go check out Eddie on social medias as well, give him a follow, Instagram, TikTok, all that good stuff as well, and then make sure you go follow DWC Wrestling Club as well, Dubuque Wrestling Club. Make sure you're keeping up with, all their results and everything like that. Eddie, anything else to kinda say to the crowd before you head out?
No, thanks for having me on. I hopefully people enjoy this conversation. I don't know, but it was fun
Yeah,
for
I know.
me.
Two crazy wrestler guys. I don't know if people are gonna buy into that or not, but no, it was a good one for sure. Kit says he wants to do a roundtable conversation with all of us sometime
Oh yeah, let's
and just
do that.
kind of bull crap around about different experiences and stuff like that. It might end up just being like a roast of Trevor Kittleson, like
Hmm.
like they do for all these famous people, but we'll just roast him instead. But yeah, dude, thanks for coming on. Hopefully we can do it again, and hopefully I'm up in Dubuque soon so I can come hang out with you guys and come see you guys again. So.
Heck yeah, anytime, anytime.
Absolutely.
Come for the
Alright,
next
dude.
UFC card.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Alright, man. Thank you.